Welcome, everyone. I want to thank our panel today as we have a webinar on a very essential and critical policy known as Section 230 of the 1996 Telecom Act and what that has meant for the internet ecosystem. It's promoted free expression, competition, innovation. It really is the backbone of the internet as we know it today. And we are facing more and more questions and more challenges to the concept of 230 and what it's meant not only to the internet and the more well-known companies, but to the entrepreneurs, the innovators, the new starts, the anchor institutions, our libraries, our schools, and what it means to everyone that's part of the communication and expression and business and commerce that the Section 230 provides and enables in the internet world that we've come to know over the last 3 decades. When Congress passed the Communications Decency Act, lawmakers explicitly designed key provisions inside the bill that would balance the First Amendment right of internet users with the need to create a safe online experience for Americans. And today, Section 230 has become really the foundation, the fundamental foundation of how we express on the internet. We have with us today Colin Crowell, who is the leader of the Blue Owl group, but I know him from way back as a young staffer on the House side. I was on the Senate side, and he and I got to really have the wonderful experience of being in the rooms where much of the Telecom Act was negotiated and drafted, in Section 230, as we know it today, was born. And so we want Colin to give us kind of the history of why Section 230, how and why, and what it means today. And then what, as we go forward, how should we look at 230 as the internet evolves and new technologies like AI come into place. And then we have Katherine Klosek, Director of Information Policy and Federal Relations for the Association of Research Libraries. And Katherine, it's great to have you with us and the unique voice of research libraries and what they mean around the country. And then Kate Tummarello, Executive Director at Engine, who did a fantastic job of testifying in front of the Energy and Commerce Committee last month on this very subject, but is a unique voice for the startups and the small businesses and what Section 230 means to that ecosystem. So Colin, we'll let you kick things off. You are now the resident historian and can give us the context of how 230 emerged, why it did, and the significance of 230 to how we communicate and do commerce over the internet. So
great. Thank you, Chip. And it's a delight to be here with fellow panelists and give a little bit of the history. I'll try to be succinct as I do that. But the genesis of Section 230 came in the nascent era of the internet during that time when Congress was working on a variety of telecommunications reform efforts that eventually became, part of the omnibus bill known as the Telecom Act of 1996. There were very large issues in play with long-distance companies, bell companies, cable companies, broadcasters. Almost every aspect of the telecommunications tech ecosystem was going to be affected by how the transition from analog to digital technologies occurred and the rise of the internet. And so Congress was in headlong pursuit of recalibrating the rules of the road, so to speak, to take congressional note of the changes in technology and the desire to open up markets to competition and to have innovation flourish. At the time that we were drafting key provisions of the Act, I recall in late 1994 that a local Washington lawyer who represented two of the sort of nascent internet companies, CompuServe and Prodigy, came to us at the staff level and said, hey, there's a court case working its way through the court system you all should keep an eye on, because it could have big implications for what you're doing. And that court case was the Stratton-Oakmont case. So we proceeded to continue to work in early 1995 on drafting, once again, the framework of what would become the Telecom Act of '96. And eventually what happened was in May of 1995, on the very day that we were marking up in the House Commerce Committee our draft of that bill, the Stratton-Oakmont decision came down. And essentially what that decision said was that Prodigy, which had made decisions to moderate content on what was then an electronic bulletin board, was liable for what posters on that bulletin board said. And the other company in play at that time, CompuServe, had the opposite corporate policy, which was to not moderate content at all, that people could basically say whatever they want. And so the irony was that from a public policy standpoint, if you didn't do anything to moderate content and you just let it be the wild, wild west, you ran no liability risk. But the minute you stepped in to moderate content, because maybe your service wanted to have community guidelines about certain types of content, maybe you wanted to ban porn on your site or something like that. But the minute you started to exert some content moderation, the court basically said you were having an editorial hand, and therefore you ran a liability risk. So the policy was upside down from the standpoint of members of both sides of the aisle. And eventually what happened on the House side is that we attached Section 230 when the bill came to the floor in August. And it was adopted and added to the bill by an overwhelming vote, because it was candidly not controversial at all to say that we needed to fix this court case, and we wanted to have a policy that said, that encouraged companies to moderate content. In the 1990s political context, there was a lot of emphasis on family values. And there were other things that were occurring in that same time frame around family values. And I think both Democrats and Republicans were trying to, race towards the center by embracing family values, whether that was also in the same section of the bill, the V-chip and television rating system. But it is not lost on me looking back that Section 230 was named the Internet Freedom and Family Empowerment Act. And that was the original title for Section 230 as we adopted the bill. So we eventually brought that to conference. On the Senate side, there was a different approach, which was the Communications Decency Act, which was offered by Senator Exxon of Nebraska. It too was overwhelmingly adopted in the Senate by an 84-16 vote on the Senate floor. And so that eventually became part of the drama in the conference about how to reconcile those two views. I will note, just as a historical trivia point, of the 16 senators who voted no and against the Communications Decency Act was a senator from Delaware named Joe Biden. He was one of the 16 who voted no. But the end result was basically to staple the two provisions together, adopt them both, with a provision that expedited a court review because of the dubious constitutional aspects of the Communications Decency Act. But in that era, Section 230 was not controversial. Everybody wanted to reverse that court decision, to encourage companies to exert their own First Amendment rights and to moderate content without risk of lawsuits. So that's the brief, as brief as I can give you the history of how Section 230 became a law.
And Colin, as young staffers at that point in our lives and our career, I don't know if any of us really could comprehend or imagine what Section 230 would mean as the internet and internet companies and the commercial internet emerged and rose. We did not know what a tremendous consequence and impact it would be that really did give the regulatory certainty, the legal certainty, and the investment certainty for the commercial internet to really explode during that time. And I guess the question for our policymakers today, so that was 1996, is the mission still the same? Does the Section 230 still carry out the original function? And do we need to make any changes to Section 230?
Yeah, but my own personal view on it is, I think, similar to how you teed that up, Chip, which is, we didn't fully appreciate what Section 230 would mean for the internet because we didn't fully appreciate what the internet would mean.
Yeah.
And so from that standpoint, in retrospect, it's easier to see that it was foundational. And I would say not only did it unleash a lot of economic certainty for commercial investment and innovation and growth, but it also promoted the flowering of human expression and creativity in non-commercial ways as well. And I think that was part of the benefit that Section 230 provided and has lasted a quarter of a century, largely intact. My own view is that the principle is sort of immutable, that the general principle that you are not responsible for the speech of others, and to make sure that people are not affected by a chilling effect of having to double check, triple check anything that they may post, retweet on the internet for fear of liability, of being sued. Because that, I think, is something that many people don't appreciate about Section 230, is that, yes, it protects interactive computer services from liability for the speech of others, but it also protects all of us. It protects every user. So each of us, if we were to repost or retweet, Section 230 also protects us in the same way. And I think that's a very important principle that should be retained.
Hey, you represent Engine. Tell us a little bit about Engine, your mission, your advocacy, and what Section 230 means to your companies that you represent and to the internet ecosystem of new starts, small businesses, the innovation, the entrepreneurial, really core culture that the internet has created, and why 230 is really essential.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. So Engine is a nonprofit based in DC, and we work with a network of several thousand startups across the country. We have startups kind of in all industries and all sectors and all types and sizes, but that includes a large portion of small internet platforms, right? And I think when we talk about 230 so often, the conversation is about not just big tech companies, but large social media platforms, which makes sense. That's probably what most members of Congress are familiar with. But 230 is much bigger than that. And I think if anything, changing 230 or repealing 230 would kind of disproportionately impact the small companies that are most afraid of litigation or at least equipped to deal with litigation costs. And so when I say small platforms and it's beyond just social media, I'm thinking of, we have a startup in our network that is a review website for people with physical limitations. So for instance, wheelchair users. So they can share information about whether a bathroom in a public park is accessible for wheelchair users. That's a community that isn't necessarily going to be the focus of a large review platform or a big social media network. And so the existence of this small niche platform is really important for those people. If, for instance, somebody uploaded something saying a doctor's office was not ADA compliant or something, and the platform could get sued by that doctor's office, not only would the platform be in a very tough position of having to hire a lawyer even to just review a demand letter, which can cost a lot of money, but they'd also have to take down user speech to avoid a lawsuit. And that's not good for the platform either way. Startups have on average, tens of thousands of dollars a month at most as a successful startup to cover all of its expenses. And dealing with litigation can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So when you multiply that across all kinds of user content that could give rise to even the threat of litigation, I think you'd see startups, really start to remove content at a rate that would make their users really unhappy, which not only costs a lot of time and money, but also makes it really hard to grow. And so 230 is a really important protection for not just the startup platforms themselves, which is of course what we care about, but also for users of all sizes of platforms. And I think that can often get lost. I mean, the congressional conversations about 230.
So some people say, why don't we just go after big tech? Why don't we carve out so that small businesses and small platforms and startups like you represent will be protected? So we'll just go after the big and not harm the small. Why is that flawed thinking? And if you could just talk through the consequence throughout the ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. We are always at Engine skeptical of small business carve-outs, which maybe is a little counterintuitive. But every startup wants to get big, or at least every startup I've ever talked to wants to grow and be, if not the size of a big tech platform, big enough to compete with those platforms. So I think the idea that we could write rules of the road based on who's big today kind of shortchanges who could be big tomorrow. And then the other point I always like to make about startups and carve-outs is it's very difficult for something like this to write a carve out that doesn't necessitate entirely reworking your business model when you hit some arbitrary threshold. User number isn't a great measure of how equipped a company is to deal with compliance or litigation costs. We have startups with hundreds of thousands of users and 2 people who run the platform. They're not, just because they have a lot of users doesn't mean they have the bandwidth to necessarily go to court or build the equivalent of content ID to find a specific type of content. So that I think is already a problem. And then when you hit that magic number, which again, I don't think really makes sense, suddenly your business doesn't make sense anymore and you have to start over from scratch. I don't think that works either. So for startups, I don't think a carve out is kind of the neat, clean answer that people like to say it is. But also from the user perspective, right? A lot of niche communities find homes on large platforms. In my testimony in front of Energy and Commerce, I told a personal story about how I was able to use an internet community that's kind of under legal threat constantly when I needed it at a time in my life. And I mentioned I use a Facebook group that I'm still a pretty active member of. I would hate to see that Facebook group disappear. It's a small group of people who dealt with what I was dealing with. And it's definitely at risk due to kind of the changing landscape at the state level on reproductive speech rights. But it's a Facebook group. Facebook would, but like that's the home of it. And if they didn't have 230, they wouldn't be able to host that content either.
And Katherine, tell us a little bit about the Association of Research Libraries, why 230 is important to your institutions, that really the anchor institutions in each of the states across the country. Why does 230 matter to your institutions, your community?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for hosting this timely conversation. The Association of Research Libraries, we're 127 libraries throughout the US. We do have some Canadian members as well. Our members are mostly co-located within institutions of higher education. We also have 2 members that are public research libraries. So that's Boston Public and New York Public Library. And our membership also includes federal members. So that's the Library of Congress, National Agricultural Library, Smithsonian Libraries and Archives, and National Library of Medicine as well. And so in our conversations and advocacy around Section 230, we have been pointing out that, in fact, libraries and educational institutions are named in the statutory definition of interactive computer service. And so we definitely have a stake in, in any conversations about reforming or repealing Section 230. And so that's been our message to Congress, and we're happy to be here as part of this conversation today as well. Last summer we held a briefing for Senate staffers in partnership with Wikimedia Foundation. And that was really about how Section 230 advances Congress's original intent, which we heard a little bit about, from Colin, to foster a forum for diverse political discourse, cultural development, and intellectual activity. That language is all from the statute's findings and policy section. And so I think that gets us into some of the ways that libraries rely on Section 230. Of course, libraries support research, scholarship, teaching, and learning. Many libraries are digitizing their collections, which are, made up of third-party speech and research, and making them available to the public to search and discover. We also acquire digital works in the formats of, databases, scholarly journals, and ebooks. And so I think a question that we have is, will libraries be forced to stop making research and educational and cultural materials widely available due to concerns about liability for what might be in our collections, the third-party speech that's in our collections? And as you know, libraries and archives also host crowdsource initiatives, right? So we might invite the public in to comment or to provide input on transcribing historical newspapers, letters, diaries, and things like that. And we also libraries host digital archives that are full of third-party content, oral histories, citizen science, digital humanities projects. And Colin mentioned community guidelines. A lot of these repositories or initiatives or online conversations that we host are governed by community guidelines. And so I think our concern is that libraries might not be able to do this work if we are worried about liability for third-party content or comments. Libraries can't vet all third-party content and conversation, and we don't want to. We believe in surveillance-free access to information, and we think many of the examples that I described are really what Section 230 exists to protect. Again, discourse, cultural development, and intellectual activity.
And Katherine, when I was in Congress, Republican, Colin worked for then Congressman Markey, now Senator Markey, Democrat. Your discussions on academic research and all the different types of debates that we could have, it really affects both right and left, and conservative and liberal, and every type of viewpoint and discussion in the great American debates that we have. So it's not a right-left issue, is it? It's really a complete freedom of expression, and as we have these debates in every single sector of American life and history and research.
I think that's right. I mean, libraries are about, providing access to information, multiple perspectives, information that might be challenging or, uncomfortable to some. And I think, libraries are not neutral. I can't stress that enough, but we are about, providing access to information, helping people, think through, again, different perspectives, even challenging perspectives. So yeah, I think that the role that libraries play is certainly not partisan. And yeah, in the conversations that we've had, I think we've found that sort of describing the role and function of libraries does seem to resonate with some on both sides of the aisle. But there is this sort of, political environment that we're in that where there are some extremist lawmakers who are pushing censorship initiatives, essentially. And I think a major concern that libraries have around the legislative proposal that we see in front of us, which is to sunset Section 230, is that it would effectively lead to self-censorship if, libraries and other platforms, the examples that Kate gave, would have to proactively take information down or do some kind of filtering or screening due to the loss of that regulatory certainty.
Now, Colin, after you left public service, you worked for a large tech company, platform company, Twitter. This debate over big and small, or carve-outs, but talk a little bit about just the threat to everyone of what a frivolous lawsuits and an environment of constant litigation, what that would do to the internet ecosystem, whether you're a Twitter, now X, or any of the other types of platforms, small to large. Why is the risk of litigation so harmful?
I think the risk of litigation is harmful in a few contexts. And so, certainly, based upon my experience while I was at Twitter, you see the effect even for a company that is sort of labeled big tech, but was, sort of, I think, smaller than some of the other big tech companies. I never felt like I was at big tech when I was at Twitter. But the reality was that in the early days as a startup, and, and I think, sort of Kate talked about And I love the line she gave, which is that, you know, every startup founder wants to be big, right? And so your aspirations and your dreams are, you know, very ambitious. At the beginning of Twitter, from Jack Dorsey's first tweet, it took 3 years, 2 months, and 1 day to go from Jack's first tweet to the 1 billionth tweet. When I left Twitter at the end of 2019, Twitter was serving 1 billion tweets every 2 days. So you think of trying to deal with liability risk across 1 billion tweets every 2 days. I don't care how big your legal team is. Without the liability protection of Section 230, a company like Twitter, that service would have had a very difficult time, because rather than hiring engineers, you would have had to hire lawyers. And it also would have slowed down, because every tweet would have had to be run by perhaps a legal team review before it was posted on the platform, because of liability risk the company would run. And so the ability, and I think that's an important thing just from a public policy ecosystem perspective. Section 230 permitted, after its passage in 1996, the first chapter, the first quarter century of that public internet to be written by entrepreneurs, by innovators, by commercial investors, by nonprofit voices, and have them drive the development of what the internet could be. If you ever wanted to see the next chapter of the internet driven and written by lawyers and court judges, and think about what that internet future would look like, to me, it looks quite dystopian. For all of the deficiencies and defects of the current internet ecosystem, I think the alternative is far worse. And it's quite dystopian to me to think of the chilling effect that that would have on speech, and how it would really, I think, stultify innovation across the ecosystem as well.
Yeah, when 230 has been described both as a shield, you know, and a sword. That as you look at different threats and risk, as you, if you do need to moderate content, for whether it's malware, fraud, security, community standards, talk a little bit about how 230 does help keep the internet, not that it's perfect, but also not dystopian, that we can, on the platforms, try to create a more secure environment and ecosystem to keep out bad actors and to protect the users. So talk about 230's function, both of protecting users as well as promoting the expressions, both commercially and individually, academically, that we've been discussing today. I don't know if Kate, if you'd like to take that question, and then we'll go to Katherine and Colin.
Yeah, absolutely. And this came up a little bit in the hearing, because I mentioned in my written testimony that absent 230, I think we run a risk of a bifurcated internet where you have platforms who either don't want to or can't invest in the kind of content moderation and liability checks that Colin was describing. And right, due to free internet distributor liability jurisprudence, those companies will just bury their heads in the sand and say, we don't have knowledge of any content on our platform, let alone the illegal stuff. So we can't be found liable in court. They'd still have to go to court, which is its own cost, obviously, but they wouldn't have to pay damages or worry about ultimate liability, because dating back to the court cases in the 90s that Colin was describing, they could just say, we didn't know about it. It's not our problem. I don't think that's the internet anybody wants, where all platforms are just kind of the Wild West. They have spam, they have malware, they have harassment, they have illegal content. I don't think that's the goal. I hope that's not the goal that Congress has in mind here. And on the other hand, you have the situation Colin was describing, where companies would be so afraid of posting stuff that they would either have to review everything, which is obviously not practical, or they would likely try to use technology in a way that over removes speech. we saw this a lot after SESTA passed, the last 230 amendment that Congress got out the door, where, that was aimed at sex trafficking, which is of course horrible. And I think companies already invest a lot of time and energy in making sure their platforms don't host that kind of content. But we saw a lot of legal content that was adjacent. So I'm thinking of things like resources for people who were leaving sex work, or sex work that's lawful. We saw that content getting taken down because it was caught in these filters that companies put in place saying, well, we can't risk getting sued, so we'd rather just over remove content. So you end up in this world where some part of the internet is kind of the Wild West, where all those bad actors are allowed to just behave terribly because companies can't risk knowing about it. And the other side where it's kind of like Disneyfied, where everything is only the content that the lawyers sign off on, which is going to be super safe, but maybe not those important conversations that Katherine was alluding to. And I think that's bad for startups, certainly, but it's just bad for the internet.
I also wanted to respond to the sort of, the question about kind of frivolous lawsuits, right? I mentioned a little bit about ARL's membership and makeup, but what I didn't say is, there's also, so we have federal members, but also the academic library members, like some are private, some are public, some are large and more well-resourced, some are not, right? And so I think the concern, again, in this climate where libraries and the initiatives that we support are, in some cases under attack and, even being defunded, there is a concern about the potential financial risk, to libraries if they have to pay to fight lawsuits based on newly introduced liability. But also kind of picking up on what Kate was saying, again, libraries are advocates of access to speech and information. And so I think potential unintended consequences that we are concerned about, especially with the sunset legislation that we see before us, is that, this regulatory uncertainty or increased liability, again, could force self-censorship, which would reduce access to speech and information. Can't say it enough. I think our, partners and colleagues at the Electronic Frontier Foundation have really made the point that the speech that is most at risk is speech by historically marginalized communities. If you think about the Me Too movement, and Black Lives Matter, platforms don't always, don't have really an incentive to host this speech. And so without the liability protections of Section 230, anything that could seem controversial or subject to a lawsuit could be first on the chopping block. And again, that makes people unsafe, just like, we saw this, and Kate just described it with FOSTA-SESTA. And I think that's the potential concern here, is just to see more of that speech, and those online communities that keep people safe, that give people access to information, that allow them to see themselves in others, could be shut down, could be at risk, and then the Disneyfication, right, of the internet. So yeah, let me stop there.
And I would just add briefly, Chip, the irony for me as I look at this debate, sort of currently, as it's unfolding on Capitol Hill, is that liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, are both critiquing Section 230, but for different reasons. And I think the irony is that because they can't agree on how to change it, if they fall into the trap of agreeing on the one thing perhaps they can agree on, which is, just sunset it, it's like a O. Henry short story ending, which is, if they succeed, they might wind up with a reality that's precisely the opposite of the one that they say they're desirous of, because of the chilling effect on speech, on civic voices, about over-censorship. The irony is that they'll actually make their critique much worse if they succeed in sunsetting Section 230. And I think that's a great irony. And my hope is that any statute that's a quarter century old, even one that has been, for the reasons that we've described here, wildly successful in sort of the core public policy around free expression, investment, innovation, and driving the American economy, building an internet ecosystem that creates jobs, that has the U.S. leading the world, sort of looking over our shoulders at number 2 and 3 in the world. In that early internet era, a lot of it is attributable to the success of the Section 230 policy that was put in place. If changes are going to be made, looking back at the SESTA FOSTA example in particular, to be very, very careful and surgical, and make sure that you're not undoing things, that putting it back on the books, once you realize the mistake you've made, becomes really, really difficult.
This has been a great conversation, and just to, to give us context, since the 1996 Telecom Act, which was kind of the foundation for not only free expression in the internet through 230 and what it created, but the core principles of promoting competition and all of our networks, and then the applications that ride on top of those networks. And it gave rise to the American technology companies and internet companies that lead the world, that lead our economy, and that have made us, the pride and envy of every country that tries to compete against us. So it really is an American treasure based on enduring foundational American values of free expression and free markets, and an ecosystem of as many diverse companies, platforms, and voices as possible. It's been a huge success, but beyond anyone's imagination of when we were young once, Colin. And so it's been a great conversation, and we don't, to me, a sunset of 230 would be the equivalent of a policy and an actual train wreck. The many unintended consequences of that type of non-surgical targeted action that Colin talked about, that really would create so much uncertainty, litigation, risk, and harm to the internet ecosystem that really is the pride of our nation and the envy of the rest of the world. So I want to thank each of y'all for the different places that y'all come from, the work that each of you do, and this conversation today. I don't know if we have any questions from any of our audience members, but we hope that this is content that is valuable not only today, but as we share it with policymakers and staffers today on the Hill. Colin, who may not have been around 25 years ago and may not realize the significance of what this policy has meant to our economy and way of life. Let me see if I have it. All right, no questions, so we can wrap things up. Again, I thank each of you for being part of this webinar, and look forward to continuing to be a voice and an advocate for the competition, innovation, and freedom of expression that's critical to American success.